Let's go through the quiz. We'll go over all the problems, all the answers, all the points. Anything you did not get full credit on, you should be fixing on your own, writing it down, getting another piece of paper, so that you have enough time when we come back from lunch to test. I'm gonna go through this a little bit fast, but if you have questions, I can go back to something. Especially if you were not here, make sure you're writing this stuff down, or if you didn't get something, make sure you're writing stuff down. So for the first section, you had to solve these by taking the square roots. So if you didn't take the square roots, you basically missed the whole point of what we were trying to do. So number one, the work you needed to do was just take the square root of both sides, not just one, but both. And then some of you jumped straight into the answer from here, which was fine. But you should have had both the positive and the negative version. So if you didn't put plus minus, you left off half of the answer. If you didn't put them in curly brackets, that's what your answer is supposed to be in. So make sure you do both of those things. Questions on that one? For number two.
Question.
Yes.
So if you don't like the plus or minus, it's
Yes. Because even though when you take the square root of 16, it is positive 4, negative 10 to negative is also the same thing. So you need both. In number two, you would subtract 4 both sides, take the square root. In this case, this is the only case you do not need a plus or minus because there is no such thing as a plus, positive, and negative zero. It's just 0. So if you put plus and minus, it didn't take it off, but for 0 only, you don't need plus minus. For number 3, you should have first divided both sides by 4. Most of you did that. Some of you did not. I'll talk about what some of you may have did instead. Then take the square root of both sides and put that in curly brackets.
okay. Also, then curly brackets.
So for this one, some of you took the square root first and then divided. You ended up getting the right answer, but you got lucky because that won't always work. So don't do that. Isolate your m squared first. Divide, take the square root, take the brackets. Questions on 3? Four, you had to get rid of the 6 by adding. Then divide. Then take the square root of both sides. So for each problem, doing the work was 1 point and getting the answer was 1 point. Do we have any questions on that section in general? Remember that this next objective was 3, not 2. But you just had to find the solutions. Where does your parabola cross the x-axis? And write those as ordered pairs. So 5 should have had 2 at -3, 0. and at 1, 0. So as long as you put those correct points in the correct order, you were fine. If you started putting other things, then you are not. 6 only had 1. At 4, 0. 7 had 2 and so did 8. So 7 were at negative 4, 0 at 4, 0. And 8 was at negative 5, 0 and negative 1. Questions about those? All right. How you found it? We can see where it is from. And then write those up over here. Page. I already made like an and symbol, but I can't do the actual and symbol.
Oh,
It's just
no,
a and.
only just.
You don't have to do that, or comma, just,
Okay.
you don't have to do that. Other questions on this section? For the most part, this is the section you guys did fine on, so I expect that you guys will still do fine on this, as long as you put them in the correct order, don't switch them, don't combine. We're not looking for vertex or anything else here. Then on to the back. So you'll see that the points were changed because the number of points didn't match the direction. That was my mistake, because it was supposed to happen, that was supposed to happen before I got printed. So you had to do the following. Graph each one, write the solutions of each one, and then off to the side I wrote state/show how you found your vertex. So that's not saying I need to know what the vertex is. That's me saying, tell me how you found it. The graph, the table, algebraically, I would see it algebraically if you did it that way. And you have to do that for each one. So if you found it in the graph for each one, say that for each one. If you found it in the graph for the first two, but the table for the last two, say that. Okay. So I'm going to show you half of the algebraic way for each. I'm going to show you the table you would have got for each, and then obviously what the graph would look like and the solutions. So, and if you didn't do it algebraically, don't freak out, you didn't have to. So algebraically, I started to do the x equals negative b over 2a for each one. So this would be negative 16 over 2 times negative 2. And that would give us negative 16 over negative 4. That would just give us 4. I did that part algebraically, and then I put this into your y equals. And remember that those steps are over there, so if you need them, please use them. So I put this into y equals, I graphed it, I found the table. That table was this. So once I found that x was negative 4, I looked where x was 4 and then looked elsewhere. As long as you find the point in the middle on the table, you don't have to do this part. These would be the 5 points that you're graphing. 2, negative 6, 3, 0, 4, 2, 5, 0, 6, 6. And it'll look something like that. You do need to have 5 points graph. You can have more than that, but you shouldn't have less than that. And your two solutions were 3, 0, and 5, 0. So you didn't have to write out the table. If you put found in table, that was fine. You put found in graph, that was fine. Make sure you're putting that for each. If you put the table, that's fine. If you show it algebraically, that's fine. I just need to see one of those ways. Questions on 9? All right. How did you find the one here? I put this into y equals, and this is literally the table. So I didn't do this work. This is the calculator. Other questions? Which wherever it crosses the inside. So if it doesn't, that would be no solution. So then number 10, I'm going to do the same things. So my algebraic portion of it was -6 over 2 times 1, which was 6 over 2 equals 3. The table I found from the calculator was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5, 2, 1. Remember that your points should mirror each other. So 1, 5, 2, 2, 3, 1. 5. So what you have on one side, it should look the exact same on the other. Questions on 10? Oh, and this was no solution. We didn't cross the x-axis out. But the steps are up here. How to find the vertex by the graph, how to find the vertex by the table. Please use that. And for 11, the algebraic work would have been x equals -4 over 2 times -2. So -4 over -4, or x equals 1. The table, once you put this into your calculator, would have been -1, 0, 1, 2, 3. -12, -6, -4, and then repeat. So it'll look something like -1, -12, 0, -6, 1, -4, and then repeat. Something like that. And this again did not cross the x-axis, so this was no. What questions do we have on 11? It doesn't cross the x-axis. Yeah, so it has, if it said something with a 0, -1, 0, 1, 0, 2, 0, something in there, then that would be one of your solutions, or if you saw it cross the x-axis. That's the only time you have a solution. Okay. So like 12 does. Algebraically, that would be -6 over 2 times 1. So 6 over 2. And that table was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 0, -3, -4, and 3. So 1, 0, 2, -3, 3, -4, and then repeat. And here, because it crosses the x-axis, you have two solutions. What questions do we have on 12? All right.
Actually, on mine, but I didn't use the graph to the Y values, but I still think. I'm not sure I can do more.
You put it in Y already. Okay. Then on to the back. Oh, really quickly, sorry. So the graph was worth 1 point, showing how you found the vertex algebraically in the table, graphically was worth 1 point, and then the solution. So 9 and 12 were worth 4, and 10 and 11 were worth 3. For the last section, it gives you the formula. You just have to put everything in. So the first thing you should have done was label your ABC in the box without the variable. So for 13, 1, -8, 16. Because it's just the number, it's not the variable. And then proceed to do your formula. So x equals -8, -8, sorry. Some of you made that positive right away, that was fine. Plus or minus the square root of -8 squared minus 4 times 1 times 16 all over 2 times a. Make sure you're using parentheses, especially inside. Some of you made this positive 64 right away, and that was okay. You can skip those steps. And then keep simplifying. 8 plus or minus 64 minus 64 all over 2. Some of you, yes. This one was -8 squared, and this one was multiplying these.
Like multiplying -4.
Yeah. Some of you, when you put -8 squared in, got a negative, and I imagine you were doing something like this. Either not using parentheses or putting the square with the parentheses, it needs to be outside. So then we have 8 plus or minus 0 all over 2. Make sure you're putting your x equals or n equals or a equals, whatever the variable is, for each line. The square root of 0 is just 0. Separate your 2, the minus and the plus. And then after that, whether you simplified it again by hand or put it all in your calculator was up to you. I just needed the final answer. These would have given you the same answer, so you should not have put it twice. There are no repeats in curly brackets. So then points wise, each of these are worth 6. Did you define your variables or A, B, and C correctly? Set it up correctly? Simplify to this part and show how you got that correctly. Simplify it with a perfect square, separate, and get the final answer. Page. If you get a plus or minus, in this case, it was just one answer. So this would be 8/2. And this would also be 8. So it gives you the exact same.
So if it was like,
If it was,
I just don't understand what they.
here we have plus or minus already. It would depend on what you get here. So this may not be the same, +4, -4, it might be like -2 and 5. So you'll see it. Yes, for all of these answers, you should have really rough. Other questions on this one? Let's go to the next one, and then Kate, if you're still confused on that, let me know. So this answer will kind of answer your question. So this would be 211 -76. Here we're going to use n equals -11 plus or minus the square root of 11 squared minus 4 times 2 times -76. All over 2 times 2. Yeah. Then start to simplify. -11 plus or minus 121 plus, I think that was 608. Over 4. And then when you added those together, you got 729. If you're not sure if it's a perfect square or not, put it in your calculator. It was. And it was 27. Then you would take it and separate it. -11 minus 27 over 4 and -11 plus 27. So Paige, this is where the plus and minus comes in, but the answers may not be the same. Once you simplified that or did -11 minus 27 divided by 4, and the same thing for the plus, you should have gotten -19/2 or -9.5 and +4. And remember to also put them least to greatest. Sorry. These would have given you the exact same number, 4 and 4. So you only need to put it once. Right, because yeah, you don't need to do that unless they're the same number, but one's negative, one's positive. Oh, these are two different numbers. You don't have to. We'll label this and write out how it's set up for this next one, and then we'll stop and finish that one. 2, -1, -3 for your ABC values. And the setup for this would be n equals -1 plus or minus square root of -1 squared minus 4 times 2 times -3 all over 2 times. And we'll finish that when we come back from lunch. Okay, so we set this up. Start to simplify. This is too far. So n equals +1 plus or minus the square root of 1 plus 25. And 4, sorry. Over 4. And then if you added those, you get 25. Square root of 25 is a whole number. 5. And then you would separate it. 1 minus 5. And 1 plus 5. Both over 4. Simplify what those are. And you would get -1 and 3 over 2 is your final answer. Or -1 and 1.5 as your final answer. What questions do we have on that one? Sid, did you have a question? So you can either put this on your calculator all at once. So if I go 1 minus 5 all over 4. Or you can do 1 minus 5 divided by 4. Either or. And then the same thing with the other one. So then for the last one, our numbers were 1, -5, and -6. So A equals -5 plus or minus the square root of -5 squared minus 4 times 1 times -6 all over 2 times 1. And then start to simplify. +5 plus or minus the square root of 25 plus 24 all over 2. Add those together. You get 49. (49) is a perfect square. And you would get 7. Separate them. The 5 minus 7 all over 2 and 5 plus 7. So once you simplify both, You would get -1 and 6. Girls, make sure you're paying attention. Questions on that one? Any other general specific questions or
With the graphs. The calculation is that. I know that you can do it like, I'm not calculating, but like, I don't know how to do. Making chart. So like, having you. Just do it on. Can you like show?
Can you put any equation out? Graph. And I would use those steps to find the vertex and find each of the points. So, what's it? Second trace. To find the minimum or maximum. You have to pick points. That will tell you your minimum or your vertex. Second trace will also tell you your other points. It doesn't say value, but going to value, pick the other numbers you need. This was -4. You would need -3, -2, and so on and so forth. And you can find those from here. Or you could go to your table and find them from there. Find the middle where your Y values factor. We plot those. Other general specific questions? Colton and Megan were asking about the table earlier, so really the table I wrote is from this. So if you just find where the middle is, where the Y values have repeated, you can go on from there. Any other general specific questions?
You know what's the first part?
Can I go back to the first part? No, I was going back to it. It was pretty slow.
Yeah, okay.
Any other general specific questions? You taking a picture is gonna help you. Okay. It's also a video, so you can go back and look at it. Now you're off your desk. Go put your cell phone, smartwatches, in a calculator pocket. Grab a calculator if you haven't already.